Imagine a Saturday morning in 1964. You aren't scrolling through a screen in your pajamas. You are standing in front of a mirror, adjusting a hat that perfectly matches your purse. You pull on pristine white gloves and step into a tailored suit because today you aren't just buying things. You are going to the department store. Stepping through those heavy revolving doors meant entering a sanctuary of crystal chandeliers, the scent of expensive perfume, and elevator operators who announced floors like ringmasters. It was a world where lunch meant white tablecloths in the tea room and shopping was a genuine cultural event. But walk into a mall today and you're walking into a graveyard. Those cathedrals of commerce are now rotting skeletons, boarded up or filled with scattered, discounted racks that feel more like a garage sale than a glamorous outing. We love to blame the internet for killing this golden age, assuming Amazon fired the fatal shot. But the truth is much darker and far more complex. The poison was actually administered long before the first online checkout existed. To understand how we lost the magic, we have to go back to the peak of the 1960s, because the clues to this murder were hiding in plain sight amidst the glamour. To truly understand the magnitude of what we have lost, we have to immerse ourselves fully in the texture and the rhythm of the early to mid-1960s. We need to strip away the modern convenience of one-click ordering and same-day delivery to appreciate a time when the acquisition of goods was not a chore to be rushed through, but a ceremony to be savored. In 1962 or 1965, the department store was not merely a building that housed inventory, it was the undisputed anchor of public life, a cultural institution that held as much weight in the community as the church or the post office. It was the physical manifestation of the American dream, packaged in a box with a satin bow, and the experience began long before you ever saw the merchandise. The ritual started in the bedroom. Today, we might run to the grocery store in sweatpants or browse online shops while lying in bed. But in the 1960s, going downtown to the department store required a transformation. You had to look the part. For women, this meant a level of grooming that has all but vanished from the modern consumer experience. We are talking about the era of the tailored skirt suit, often inspired by the impeccable style of Jackie Kennedy, paired with a pillbox hat and kitten heels that clicked purposefully on the pavement. It was a time when a lady did not leave the house without her pantyhose perfectly straight and her white gloves spotless. Men, too, if they were joining the excursion, donned fedoras and pressed slacks. This dress code wasn't a rule written on the door, it was a social contract. You dressed up out of respect for the occasion, and in turn, the store treated you like royalty. When you arrived at the city center, the store itself loomed like a palace. Whether it was Marshall Field's in Chicago, Hudson's in Detroit, or Macy's in New York, the architecture was designed to intimidate and inspire. These were massive limestone beasts occupying entire city blocks, featuring grand display windows that were essentially theater stages frozen in time. Window shopping was a legitimate pastime, a form of free entertainment where families would stroll past intricate scenes of mannequins dressed in the latest Parisian-inspired fashions, surrounded by props that told a story of a life you desperately wanted to live. Passing through the heavy revolving doors, brass handles gleaming from constant polishing, was like crossing a portal into a different atmosphere. The first thing to hit you was the smell. It was a distinct, intoxicating cocktail of expensive fragrances wafting from the cosmetics counter, mixed with the scent of leather from the handbag department and the faint, crisp aroma of new fabric. The ground floor was always a sensory overload of crystal and light. The ceiling soared 20 feet high, adorned with chandeliers that wouldn't look out of place in a ballroom. The flooring was often marble or terrazzo, polished to a mirror shine that reflected the bustling energy of the space. This is where the starkest contrast to today lies: the people. The floor was teeming with staff, but not the disinterested teenagers you might find leaning against a wall in a modern retail box. These were career professionals. In the 1960s, being a sales clerk at a high-end department store was a respected vocation. The woman behind the cosmetics counter didn't just ring you up. She was a consultant, a confidant, and an expert who knew the inventory down to the molecule. She wore a uniform that commanded authority, and she addressed you by name if you were a regular. If you were looking for a lipstick, she didn't point you to an aisle. She sat you down, applied it for you, and discussed how it complemented your complexion. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the golden age of shopping and want to receive more stories like this one that explore the hidden history of our daily lives, please take a second to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us keep these memories alive. Moving deeper into the store, the level of service felt almost overwhelming by modern standards. You didn't carry your purchases around like a pack mule. If you bought a winter coat or a set of china, you simply arranged for it to be sent to your home. Delivery was standard, often free, and executed with military precision. The store had its own fleet of trucks, and the drivers were as much a part of the brand as the merchandise. There was a level of trust inherent in the transaction. You could put massive purchases on your charge plate, a metal precursor to the credit card, often kept in a little leather sleeve, and the store would simply bill you at the end of the month. It was a relationship based on honor and community standing. To ascend to the upper floors, you didn't just press a button. You stepped into an elevator that was a small room unto itself, operated by a uniformed attendant in white gloves. The operator would announce the floors with a rhythmic cadence, listing the departments available on each level. Second floor, men's furnishings and haberdashery. Third floor, ladies' lingerie and foundations. Fourth floor, children's shoes and toys. The doors would slide open with a mechanical hiss, revealing a new world at every stop. If you stepped out onto the fourth floor, you weren't just looking at shelves of toys. You were entering a wonderland designed to overwhelm the senses of any child born in the baby boom era. There were electric trains chugging through miniature villages that were detailed down to the tiny, painted pedestrians. There were dolls that could cry, wet, and blink, displayed in nurseries that looked better furnished than some actual homes. This wasn't just retail, it was a permanent exhibition, a museum of desire where everything was for sale. Yet the atmosphere suggested that simply looking was payment enough. But the crown jewel of the 1960s department store experience, the element that truly separates that era from our current reality of food courts and grab-and-go pretzels, was the tea room. Located usually on the top floor, far removed from the noise of the street, the tea room was a bastion of civility. It was here that the ritual of getting dressed up to shop found its ultimate justification. You didn't just grab a sandwich. You were seated by a maitre d' at a table draped in heavy white linen. The silverware was real silver, heavy in your hand, and the water was poured from crystal pitchers. The menu in these establishments was a time capsule of mid-century American cuisine. Dishes like chicken a la king in puff pastry shells, Maurice salads, and delicate finger sandwiches with crusts surgically removed. For a child, being taken to the tea room was a rite of passage. It was a test of manners. You had to sit still, napkin in lap, while your mother and her friends discussed the news or the neighbors over cups of coffee that were endlessly refilled by waitresses in starched aprons. In many of the grander stores, there was live entertainment. A pianist might play soft jazz standards, or even more impressively, models would weave through the tables in a live fashion show. These women, impossibly elegant, would pause at your table, spin slowly to show off the drape of a new coat or the cut of an evening gown, and hand you a card with the item number and price. It was immersive marketing before the term existed, blending the social act of dining with the commercial act of buying until you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Beneath this veneer of effortless luxury, however, a massive hidden machine was churning. While you sipped your tea, pneumatic tubes, a technology that felt like science fiction then, but looks like steampunk now, were whizzing through the walls, carrying cash and receipts from the sales floor to a central counting room in the basement. Deep in the bowels of the building, armies of gift wrappers were folding paper with origami-like precision, creating the signature look of the store. A box from Saks or Lord & Taylor was a status symbol in itself, a signifier that you were a participant in this grand urban life. But here is where the story takes a turn. Here is where we find the twist that most people overlook when they get nostalgic about this era. We tend to think the department store died because people stopped caring, or because the internet came along 50 years later to steal the market share. But the truth is, the department store began to die at the exact moment it seemed most invincible. The seed of its destruction was planted in the mid-1960s, and ironically, it was planted by the department stores themselves. While the downtown flagship stores were bustling with women in gloves and hats, a massive demographic shift was tearing the fabric of American cities apart. The suburbs were exploding. The GI Bill and the highway system had created a new version of the American dream that didn't involve a city apartment. It involved a split-level house with a two-car garage and a lawn in places like Levittown or the sprawling outskirts of Los Angeles. The very families that sustained the downtown department stores were packing up and leaving the city centers in droves, fleeing the noise, the grime, and the changing demographics of the urban core for the manicured quiet of the suburbs. The department store tycoons saw this happening. They were smart businessmen, after all. They realized that if the customer wouldn't come to the city, the store had to go to the customer. and so they made a fateful decision that would eventually cannibalize their own existence. They invented the branch store and became the anchors of the indoor shopping mall. By 1965, the shopping mall was transitioning from an experiment to a dominant cultural force. But these early malls needed legitimacy. They couldn't just be collections of small shops. They needed a heavy hitter to draw the crowds. The downtown giants, Macy's, Sears, JCPenney, Hudson's, agreed to open smaller, more efficient versions of themselves in these new suburban fortresses. They thought they were expanding their empire, capturing the suburban dollar while keeping the downtown flagship as the crown jewel. But they miscalculated. They didn't realize that by standardizing the experience, they were killing the magic. The new suburban branch stores were convenient, yes. They had massive parking lots, so you didn't have to take a train or pay for a garage. You didn't have to dress up as much because it was just down the road. The architecture was lower, flatter, less ornate. There were no crystal chandeliers, no elevator operators, and often no tea rooms. The inventory was trimmed down to the greatest hits, removing the eccentric, slow-moving items that gave the downtown stores their character. In trying to chase the suburban housewife who drove a station wagon, the department stores accidentally taught the public that shopping didn't need to be an event. They taught us that it could be a chore, something to be done quickly between dropping the kids off at soccer practice and making dinner. They stripped away the theater of the experience, the windows, the architecture, the dressing up, in favor of efficiency and accessibility. The mid-1960s, therefore, was a time of schizophrenia for the retail world. On one hand, the downtown stores were still operating with the grandeur of the Titanic, orchestras playing and champagne flowing. On the other hand, the owners were busy building the lifeboats, the suburban mall stores, that would eventually drain the main ship of all its passengers. This shift was subtle at first. In 1966, you might still go downtown for Christmas shopping to see the big tree and the animated windows, but for your everyday needs, school clothes, bedding, a new toaster, you went to the mall. The mall was climate-controlled, safe, and modern. It was the future. But every dollar spent at the mall was a dollar starved from the downtown flagship. The incredible overhead costs of maintaining those limestone palaces, the electricity for the chandeliers, the wages for the elevator operators, the fresh flowers in the cosmetics department relied on massive volume. As that volume trickled away to the convenient, soulless boxes in the suburbs, the math stopped working. The rot had begun, not with a bang, but with the turning of an ignition key in a suburban driveway. The year 1962 is often cited by retail historians as the single most significant year in the history of American shopping, a year that quietly armed the bomb that would eventually blow the grand department store model to smithereens. While the ladies in the tea rooms were delicately slicing their puff pastries, three titans were born that would rewrite the rules of commerce. Kmart, Target, and Walmart all opened their first doors in that same calendar year. At the time, they seemed like jagged, ugly little novelties compared to the marble-floored giants downtown. They were discount stores, a term that carried a heavy stigma. To shop there was to admit a certain defeat, or at least a lack of taste. These stores didn't have elevator operators or window displays. They had fluorescent tube lighting that hummed like an angry insect, linoleum floors that smelled of industrial cleaner, and merchandise piled high on metal gondolas. But by the late 1960s, the stigma was evaporating under the heat of inflation and a changing culture. The department store, with its massive overhead costs, the armies of staff, the free delivery fleets, the air conditioning for cavernous spaces, could not compete on price. They were selling a lifestyle, while the new discounters were selling commodities. A tube of toothpaste or a toaster didn't work any better just because it was bought in a building with a doorman. As the decade wore on, the American consumer began to develop a split personality. They would still go to the department store for the good coat or the wedding present, but for the socks, the underwear, and the household cleaners, they defected to the discounters. This was the first major crack in the foundation, the loss of the everyday staple business. The department stores were left with the high-margin, slow-moving luxury items, losing the steady cash flow of the daily necessities that kept the lights on. Simultaneously, a cultural war was being fought in the aisles of the women's fashion department. The mid-1960s saw the rise of the youth quake. The baby boomers were coming of age, and they were the first generation to violently reject the aesthetic values of their parents. The department store was built on the concept of the lady. It was an ecosystem designed for women who wore hats, gloves, girdles, and matched their shoes to their handbags. But suddenly, the streets were filled with teenagers wearing miniskirts, go-go boots, and peasant blouses. They wanted Mary Quant, not Coco Chanel. They wanted fast, cheap, disposable fashion that they could dance in, not investment pieces that would last a decade. The department stores were like aging aristocrats trying to learn the slang of teenagers. It was awkward and embarrassing. They tried to pivot. They created junior departments with psychedelic wallpaper and rock music blaring from speakers, attempting to lure in the hippies and the mods. But the disconnect was palpable. You couldn't sell counterculture revolution in a building that represented the ultimate establishment. The young people smelled the inauthenticity. They preferred boutiques, small, independent, funky shops that popped up in converted brownstones or basements, places that smelled of incense rather than expensive perfume. The department store, once the arbiter of all that was cool and modern, was suddenly rendered square. It became the place where your mother shopped, and for a teenager in 1968, that was the kiss of death. As the decade spiraled toward its chaotic conclusion, the external pressures on the downtown flagship stores turned from economic to existential. We cannot talk about the death of the department store without addressing the physical reality of the American city in the late 1960s. The white flight that had started as a trickle to the suburbs became a torrent. The urban centers, neglected by city planners and redlined by banks, became flashpoints of social unrest. The summers of 1967 and 1968 saw riots and civil disturbances in Detroit, Newark, Washington, D.C., and dozens of other major cities, the very cities that hosted the grandest department stores. For the suburban shopper, the psychological barrier to going downtown became insurmountable. The narrative shifted from going to the city is an event to going to the city is dangerous. The department store owners watched in horror as smoke billowed past their carefully curated window displays. In some cases, the stores themselves were looted or damaged, but the physical damage was nothing compared to the reputational damage. The grand, safe sanctuary of the department store was breached. The illusion was shattered. Why risk a trip downtown, navigating protests or crime, when you could drive your station wagon to the pristine, climate-controlled, security-patrolled mall in the suburbs? By 1969, the ritual of getting dressed up to shop was on life support. The hat and gloves had been discarded in favor of polyester pantsuits and denim. The white-gloved elevator operators were being replaced by automatic buttons to save on labor costs. The free delivery services were quietly curtailed or charged for. The tea rooms began to close or downgrade their menus, replacing the silver service with stainless steel. The department store was cutting off its own limbs to survive, shedding the very amenities that made it special in a desperate attempt to lower prices and compete with the malls and discounters. But the tragedy wasn't just in the balance sheets. It was in the loss of the public square. The downtown department store had been a place where different classes brushed shoulders. The wealthy matron and the working-class secretary might buy the same lipstick or admire the same Christmas tree. It was a democratic space wrapped in luxury. The mall, by contrast, was segregated by geography and income. The demise of the downtown store mirrored the fragmentation of society itself. We retreated into our suburban enclaves, shopping in stores that mirrored our specific demographic, losing that grand, chaotic, beautiful mix of humanity that swirled through the revolving doors of Macy's or Marshall Field's. As the 1960s bled into the 1970s, the department stores that remained were hollow shells of their former selves. They were massive ships drifting without an engine. The buildings were still there, the names were still on the facade, but the soul had been evacuated. The specialized knowledge of the staff was gone, replaced by minimum-wage clerks who didn't know the difference between silk and rayon. The magic of the window displays became an afterthought, a budget line item to be minimized. The department store had survived the 1960s, but it had emerged with a terminal illness. It had traded its identity for survival, and in doing so, it ensured that it would never again hold the heart of the American consumer. The stage was set for the final act. A slow, painful decline that would drag on for decades, but the fatal blow had undoubtedly been struck in the turbulent, transformative years of the swinging 60s. We stopped dressing up because there was no longer anywhere worth dressing up for. The theater was closed. We were just buying stuff now. The silence inside a dead department store is heavy. If you were to break into one of the boarded-up flagships in a Rust Belt city today, or walk through the hollowed-out carcass of a mall anchor that closed the last year, you would feel a specific kind of haunting. It isn't just the absence of noise, it is the presence of a vacuum. Standing in the center of a cosmetic department stripped bare, where the floor still bears the faint, discolored outlines of display cases, you are standing in the wreckage of a civilization. To understand the gravity of this loss, we have to look back one last time at the 1960s, not just as a decade of change, but as the final frantic heartbeat of a way of living that prioritized dignity over convenience. The death of the department store was not merely a change in how we buy, it was a fundamental shift in how we perceive ourselves and our place in the public sphere. When we look back at the footage from 1965 or 1967, seeing those crowds pressing against the glass to see the Christmas displays, we aren't just looking at shoppers. We are looking at a society that agreed to participate in a collective illusion of grandeur. The department store was the stage, and we were both the audience and the actors. By dressing up, by putting on that hat, cinching that belt, polishing those shoes, we were agreeing to play our part in a civilized society. The store, in return, validated us. It told us that we were worthy of service, worthy of beauty, and worthy of an environment that aspired to be something more than a warehouse. When the department stores panicked in the late 60s, reacting to the riots and the suburbs and the discounters, they didn't just cut costs, they broke that social contract. The tragedy is that they assumed the merchandise was the product. They thought they were in the business of selling shirts and blenders, but they were wrong. They were in the business of selling belonging. When they fired the elevator operator to save a few dollars an hour, they didn't just lose an employee, they lost the human voice that welcomed you. When they closed the tea room to replace it with a snack bar, they didn't just change the menu. They told the customer that their comfort was no longer a priority. The slow bleed that began in the turmoil of the late 1960s was the process of the department store becoming a vending machine. And you don't dress up for a vending machine. You don't respect a vending machine. You extract what you need from it as cheaply and quickly as possible, and then you leave. We often talk about the retail apocalypse as if it were a natural disaster, a hurricane caused by the internet that flattened the landscape. But the internet only killed the department store because the department store had already committed suicide. By the time online shopping became dominant, the department store had already spent 40 years stripping away every reason to visit it. They had become generic, placeless boxes. In the 1960s, a store in New Orleans felt different from a store in Minneapolis. They had regional pride, local buyers who understood the specific tastes of their city, and owners who lived in the community. As the consolidation mania took over in the decades following the 60s, merging unique local brands into monolithic national chains, that soul was exorcised. They homogenized the magic until it was a bland paste, indistinguishable from coast to coast. Think about the sensory experience of the 1960s, one last time. The weight of a heavy door, the crisp rustle of tissue paper, the handwriting on a sales slip. These were tactile anchors in reality. Today, our shopping experience is frictionless and weightless. We tap a glass screen and a brown cardboard box appears on our porch. It is efficient, undeniably. It is miraculous in its logistics, but it is lonely. There is no shared gaze with a stranger over a beautiful display. There is no polite exchange with a sales clerk who genuinely hopes you enjoy the purchase. We have traded the marketplace, the ancient, chaotic human center of the village, for a digital isolation booth. The department store was the last great cathedral of that marketplace, and when we stopped dressing up to go there, we stopped treating the public square as a sacred space. The ghosts of the 1960s are still there, hiding in the architecture. You can see them in the ornate molding of an old building that is now a gym or a co-working space. You can feel them in the way the escalators are positioned, designed to give you a sweeping view of a kingdom that no longer exists. The lady of the 1960s, with her white gloves and her patience, is gone. She has been replaced by the frantic, time-starved consumer who views shopping as a burden to be minimized. We gained time, perhaps. We gained low prices, certainly. But we lost the ceremony of everyday life. We lost the idea that the act of acquiring the things we need could be done with grace, with style, and with human connection. The death of the department store is a mirror reflecting our own changing values. We stopped valuing the experience because we stopped valuing the time it took to have it. We decided that cheaper was better than better. We decided that staying home was safer than venturing out. The 1960s stood at the precipice of this decision, trying desperately to hold on to the old world of elegance, while the new world of speed and efficiency clawed at the doors. The new world won. The result is a retail landscape that is brutally efficient but spiritually empty. We have all the goods we could ever want, delivered faster than we can use them, but we have nowhere left to go where we feel like royalty just for walking through the door. So, the next time you see an old black and white photograph of a busy street corner in 1964, look past the cars and the signs. Look at the people. Look at the pride in their posture as they carry those distinct logo-bearing bags. They aren't just shoppers. They are participants in a grand urban ballet. That dance is over now. The curtain came down a long time ago, and the theater is being demolished to make room for condos. But for a brief, shimmering moment in the mid-20th century, we believed that commerce could be beautiful. We believed that getting dressed up to shop wasn't a chore, but a celebration of the life we were building. And perhaps in our rush to modernize, we threw away something essential that we can never buy back, no matter how fast the shipping is. If you enjoyed this journey back in time and want to help us keep these stories from fading into history, please make sure you are subscribed to the channel. There are so many more forgotten chapters of our past that we want to explore with you, and we'd love to have you along for the ride.